Hello, history lovers. Welcome back to the History Hotel. So here we are again today. We're back at St. Mark's Church in Picton, New South Wales. Now, when I visited the cemetery, there was just so much to see here, so I decided it would probably be easier to do this in two videos rather than one, or possibly even three. Um, And just as a recap, so this is the beginning of the last video. Just as a recap, we're in Picton, New South Wales, which is a small town of about 5,000 people. It's about half an hour, 45 minutes to Sydney from the motorway. Back in the day, it probably would have been a good, almost a day's journey from Sydney over the Razorback and to Picton. I'm forever fascinated with all of the symbolism and the artistry and the meaning during the Victorian period, especially as it relates to death. This cemetery obviously has graves of all ages. I think the most recent one was 2022. But there's a lot of Victorian elements in here, Victorian headstones and lots of different materials and different things that came from that period, which I think are really fascinating. So let's have a walk through and see what we find. So we'll just take a little walk over here. There were a couple of graves to see. All three of them are so dilapidated you can't read inscriptions on them anymore. Someone here's put a little Australian flag. It might have been a family member, or who knows, maybe a soldier's buried there. Maybe it was Australia Day. There's some flowers there too, so maybe they know who's buried there. Here's one that's super sad. There's just weeds growing through it. No one's loving it. No one's taking care of it. Can't read it anymore. You wonder how old it is. I think some materials just wear faster than others, like marble, so they don't last as long. Here's a little one that says nothing. There's so many of those across the globe. And here we have a bunch of graves with wrought iron fences around them. And that's so interesting because the fences I guess mostly in the 19th century, had a dual purpose. They were meant to keep out wildlife, actually. So if you had a fresh grave, it would still smell. They wanted to protect their loved ones. So it was to keep out wildlife, but also it was considered to be a spiritual barrier as well. So it would keep the spirits of loved ones from following the family home and various things like that. So it's really interesting. It also, I guess, would keep out grave robbers and body snatchers during that time period. I don't know how many there were in Picton, but perhaps there were. So here we have Catherine, beloved wife of William Anderson, and Elizabeth, beloved wife of William Anderson. But pray tell, where is William Anderson? That might just be a story for a rainy day, one that we'll have to come back to anyway. So over here we have the graves of Charles Cecil Tildesley and Ethel May Tildesley. I thought at first that they might be husband and wife, but in my research, I guess Charles was just a 1 or 2 month old baby. He was born in August of 1892 and he died in October of 1892. And Ethel was his sister, and she lived to be a little bit older. She was born in 1880 and died in 1893, so she was only 13 years old. And that must be other members of the family there. But what a devastation that would have been. I suppose you could say or think that it was more common back in that time period, especially the 19th century. We have so much more control over diseases that people died of back then so easily. But even though it's more common, it would have still been just as awful. Here we have three tombstones that I really liked because they kind of reminded me of 18th century tombstones that I've seen in places like Boston in the US. We have Maria Wilkinson, who died in 12th of April 1916, and John Wilkinson next to her, who died November 1916. Again, I thought this was a couple who died in the same year, but I think it's mother and son because one was 77 and the other was 56. But I think that's probably the father to the left, John Wilkinson. So now we'll just take a little toddle over to this side. There you can see another wrought iron fence around a grave and more symbols on the gravestones there. And a 1960s toilet block in Australia, if you want to know what that looks like. But one of the more interesting tombstones or gravestones that I saw was this one over here with the flowers. We're getting there. So this is the grave for Rosanna Hall. And I found this really interesting because it says Rosanna Hall died 12th of July, 1886, aged 29 years old, accidentally burned to death at Picton. So I knew there was a story there and I wanted to find out what it was. It also says, also Thomas Edward Henry died 26th of May, 1883. And that would have been her son. He was about 3 months old and he would have died about 3 years before her. But when I looked at the newspapers, I saw just information that she had an accident in Picton and she was transported to Sydney Hospital. And I guess back then that probably would have been something like a whole day's journey to get into. Yeah, so that would have been a long time. We don't know. I don't know how long she was alive. I don't know what happened. I'm still looking into that. It's also interesting that her tombstone says erected by her brother T.H. Evans. I wondered why not erected by her husband. So I looked up her story just a bit. She had 3 children. So she had Thomas Henry, who died young. Her second child was a girl. Her name was Caroline Frances Rachel Hall. She was born in 1884. So that was the year after Thomas Henry. And her third child was named Cecil Ethelbert Hall, and he was born in 1885 in Picton, and he died in 1889. So he would have died about 3 or 4 years after Rosanna. But what I couldn't find was any information about Rosanna's husband. Apparently his name was Christopher Edward Hall, and he was married to Rosanna in Picton in 1882. And I could see in my research that he died in a suburb called Paddington, a suburb of Sydney called Paddington, which is now a very premium area in the eastern suburbs. And he died in 1939, so he lived quite a bit longer. But I wondered, there were some things that I read online. People were saying they didn't know what happened to him, but at the same time, I found a notice in the New South Wales Police Gazette in 1886, I think September. And it said warrant for the arrest of Christopher Hall, charged with child desertion. So I'm thinking Picton, same name. There were probably only 800 people in Picton at the time, and I know it's a common name, but this sounds like it's probably accurate in my opinion. So 1886, that was before the third child died, so he would have had 2 children then, and he probably left them with family. But the warrant says he was 36 years old. He was 5'6", so he was a shorty. He was stout. He had a sandy beard. He had whiskers and a mustache, a large nose. I don't know why that's important. Large nose, dressed in an old black felt hat and an old black cloth paget coat. Paget coat, I think, is a little bit like a trench coat back in the day. Tweed trousers, and he was considered to be a bushman or a labourer, and I think that's accurate too because Christopher Edward Hall worked in the quarry in Picton. And the warrant said that he was supposed to be making tracks for Footscray, Victoria, so another state. So very interesting, and I'll put the notice here so you history nerds can see for yourselves. In the distance, we have a gondola and an unsuspecting Australian female, which is a real problem for flat earthers. Here we have a signboard which is just mentioning the restoration projects that took place here in 2017-2018. There was a massive flood, which I was part of in 2016. There were actually emergency rescue people in canoes going down the main street of Picton. But when I saw the cemetery after that, there were tombstones that had toppled over, and there were broken tombstones, and it was just a huge mess. So they've come in and they've put a lot of effort into it. So here ahead of us, we've got a tombstone that looks like a tree trunk, and I saw this earlier in the day, and I thought it was pretty cool. Had no idea what it meant. After researching it just a little bit, it represents a brotherhood and insurance company called the Woodsmen of the World. And the tree trunk represented equality and craftsmanship. And I think they've got other symbology like nautical symbology, but mostly the tree. And so, yeah, I'm going to have to look into that a little bit further. This is the grave of Claude Stafford. We'll just keep moseying on down this way. There's a couple of newer 20th century graves. And here we have a double grave with a single headstone. So this is for John Harold Willis and Edward Willis. John Harold died on the 31st of January 1903, and Edward died on the 1st of February 1903. So I'm going to assume that they died of some disease. I'm going to have to do some research here. So they must have been brothers. And just to give you an idea, 1903, that was 2 years after Australia became a federation. So Western Australia, Tasmania, New South Wales, Northern Territory all came together as a country, 1901. So I think that's about it from History Hotel. Thank you so much for watching. Have a great day, afternoon, or evening ahead, wherever you are in the world. Be safe, be good, and be exceptional. It's so boring to be equal.